What would you do if a long-lost father showed up out of nowhere carrying years of regret and an unexpected secret? This emotional journey of forgiveness, second chances, and healing will leave you inspired and questioning your own relationships. Who will take the first step toward reconciliation? Stick around to find out. And don't forget, share with me where you're watching this video from. The snowfall outside blanketed the streets of Cedar Hill, Iowa, in a pristine layer of white. The soft hum of Christmas carols drifted from the old radio in the corner of Frank's Diner, mingling with the clinking of forks against plates. The diner was a small-town staple, modest and well-worn, with a neon sign that flickered just enough to add charm rather than frustration. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee filled the air as customers filled the booths, their chatter a comforting hum. Marlene Cooper weaved through the crowd, balancing trays with a practiced efficiency that belied the fatigue etched into her features. Her brown hair, tied in a no-nonsense ponytail, swayed slightly as she maneuvered past a table of regulars offering her cheerful holiday wishes. She responded with polite smiles, though her thoughts drifted elsewhere. Bills piling up, her old car barely running, and the holidays looming with expenses she couldn't afford. "Marlene," Joe's voice cut through the festive atmosphere. The diner owner, a stout man with a perpetually furrowed brow, motioned her over. "Less chatting, more serving. These orders won't deliver themselves." "Yes, Joe," Marlene replied, her voice light but her smile tight. She knew better than to argue during the lunch rush. As she turned to pick up another tray, the jingling of the diner's doorbell drew her attention. An elderly man shuffled in, his coat frayed at the edges and his hat barely holding its shape. His face was weathered, etched with lines of exhaustion and something deeper, perhaps sadness or weariness. Marlene watched him as he hesitated near the entrance, scanning the room with a nervous energy. He clutched a pair of glasses in one hand and a tattered bag in the other. The holiday cheer buzzing around the diner seemed to highlight his loneliness rather than ease it. "Could I sit here?" the man asked softly, pointing to an empty stool at the counter. "Of course," Marlene replied warmly, setting down her tray and grabbing a menu. "What can I get you?" The man shook his head, his hands trembling slightly. "I don't need food. I need to use a phone. I need to call my son." Marlene's co-worker, Julie, raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Instead, Marlene pulled her phone from her apron pocket and handed it to him. "Here, take your time." The man's eyes welled up with gratitude as he fumbled to dial a number. After a few attempts, he let out a frustrated sigh, pressing a hand to his forehead. I can't remember. My wallet and phone were stolen at the bus station. I thought I knew his number by heart, but..." Marlene felt a pang in her chest. "Do you know where he lives, or maybe where he works?" "Minneapolis," the man said, his voice breaking. "That's all I know. I was trying to visit him for Christmas, but now..." Joe's voice boomed from the kitchen. "Marlene, orders." Marlene glanced toward the counter where Julie was glaring at her. "I'll be right back," she told the man gently. "Don't go anywhere, okay?" As she hurried to deliver plates to a nearby table, her mind raced. The man's plight reminded her too much of her own struggles. The feeling of being adrift, unsure of how to move forward. She returned to him moments later, her voice low. "We'll figure this out, I promise." The man offered a weak smile, his shoulders relaxing slightly. But before she could say more, Joe appeared behind the counter, his expression stern. "Marlene, what's going on here?" She hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "This man needs help, Joe. He's trying to reach his son." Joe's eyes narrowed, his tone sharp. "We're running a diner, not a charity." Marlene clenched her jaw but said nothing. The man shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the counter. Sensing Joe's irritation, Julie leaned in and whispered, "You're pushing your luck." But Marlene couldn't ignore the helplessness in the man's eyes. She took a deep breath, determination hardening her resolve. "I'm helping him, Joe, whether you like it or not." Joe's expression darkened, but he didn't respond. The tension in the room was palpable, and Marlene knew she'd crossed a line. Still, she refused to back down, even as Joe stormed back into the kitchen, muttering under his breath. Turning back to the man, Marlene smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry, we'll figure something out." The lunchtime rush had transformed Frank's Diner into a whirlwind of activity. The sound of plates clattering and the hum of the coffee machine created a chaotic symphony, while the chatter of regular customers filled the air. Marlene moved through the crowd like clockwork, delivering orders with her trademark efficiency, though her eyes frequently darted toward the corner booth where Henry sat. He had taken off his tattered hat, revealing a head of thinning gray hair. His frail figure looked even smaller as he sat hunched over, nervously adjusting his glasses. The untouched glass of water in front of him shimmered under the diner's fluorescent lights. "Marlene," Joe's gruff voice broke through her thoughts. He pulled her aside near the coffee station, his expression serious. "I need everyone at full speed today. The holidays are our busiest time. If you want to keep this job, stay focused. No distractions." Marlene nodded quickly, glancing toward Henry. Her heart clenched as she noticed him rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Got it, Joe." But as she turned back to the dining area, Julie sidled up to her, her voice low and laced with skepticism. "You're really going out of your way for that guy, huh?" She gestured toward Henry with a slight tilt of her head. "You don't even know him, Marlene. What if he's scamming you? People do crazy things for money, especially this time of year." Marlene frowned, her brow furrowing. "Julie, look at him. He's not some scam artist. He reminds me of my grandpa before he passed. Besides, what kind of person would fake something like this?" Julie shrugged, her tone turning sarcastic. "Desperate people, that's who. Just saying. You might want to think twice before playing hero." Marlene bit her lip, her confidence wavering. Julie's words stuck with her as she returned to her tables, her mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. She couldn't shake the image of her late grandfather, how he'd struggled in his final years and how often he'd relied on the kindness of strangers. By the time the lunch rush started to ebb, Marlene's internal tug-of-war had become almost unbearable. Joe's warnings replayed in her mind, but so did the vulnerable look on Henry's face. As she wiped down a table, a memory surfaced, her landlord's voice last week, cold and firm. "If you're late on rent again, you're out." Taking a deep breath, Marlene made a decision. She slipped into the kitchen and grabbed a clean plate. After adding a hearty sandwich and a fresh cup of coffee, she made her way to Henry's booth. "Here," she said softly, setting the plate down in front of him. "You must be starving." Henry looked up, startled. I can't pay for this." Marlene smiled gently. "It's on me. Just eat, okay? You'll need your strength." As Henry hesitantly took a bite, Marlene slid into the seat across from him. Keeping her voice low, she said, "If you can wait a few hours until my shift ends, I'll help you find your son, I promise." Henry's eyes shimmered with gratitude. "You're very kind. I don't know how to thank you." "Just eat," Marlene said with a small smile. But as she glanced toward the counter, she noticed Joe watching her, his arms crossed and his eyes narrowed. The knot in her stomach tightened. She quickly stood and returned to her duties, hoping her act of kindness wouldn't cost her more than she could afford. Marlene unlocked the door to her modest one-bedroom apartment, ushering Henry inside as the snowstorm howled behind them. The space was humble, furnished with a thrifted couch, a scuffed coffee table, and a tiny kitchenette tucked into one corner, but it radiated a quiet warmth. A single string of Christmas lights hung around the window, casting a soft glow over the room. "I know it's not much," Marlene said, her voice tinged with apology as she turned on a small heater. "But it's home." Henry shook the snow from his tattered coat and looked around, his eyes landing on a small photo frame perched on the bookshelf. It held a picture of an older man, his smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. Henry picked it up with trembling hands. "Who's this?" he asked. Marlene glanced over, her expression softening. "My grandpa," she replied. "He passed a few years ago. You remind me of him." Henry placed the photo back gently, his face clouded with guilt. "Marlene, I can't let you do all this for me. You've already done too much, giving up your time, your money." Marlene turned to face him, her tone firm but kind. "Henry, this isn't just about you. It's about doing what feels right. If I can help, I will." Her words hung in the air, a quiet resolve that left no room for argument. While Henry settled into the worn couch, Marlene rummaged through her fridge, pulling together the last of her groceries, a few eggs, some bread, and a can of soup. As she cooked, her mind raced. How much would the train tickets cost? Would they even find Henry's son once they arrived? She shook the thoughts away, focusing instead on the rhythm of cracking eggs and butter sizzling in the pan. Henry ate in silence, his gratitude unspoken but evident in the way he savored each bite. "Thank you," he said softly when he was done, setting his plate on the coffee table. Marlene simply nodded. "Get some rest. We've got a long trip ahead of us." Hours later, the snowstorm had dulled to a quiet flurry as Marlene and Henry arrived at the train station. The platform was nearly empty, lit by flickering streetlights and the dim glow of the station's old sign. The cold bit at their faces as they hurried to the ticket counter. "One way to Minneapolis, please," Marlene said, handing over a wad of crumpled bills. The cashier printed 2 tickets, and Marlene stuffed them into her coat pocket, her heart sinking at the sight of her nearly empty wallet. As they waited for the train, Henry's voice broke the silence. "Jonathan, my son," he began hesitantly. "He's always been driven, but he's distant. I haven't seen him in years." Marlene watched Henry's face closely, noting the mixture of pride and regret in his expression. "Do you think he'll be happy to see you?" she asked carefully. Henry's eyes flickered with doubt. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've made mistakes. What if he doesn't want me back?" Before Marlene could respond, the train's horn echoed through the station, followed by a gust of cold wind as the locomotive pulled in. Passengers shuffled toward the open doors, their breath visible in the icy air. "Come on," Marlene said, nudging Henry toward the train. But Henry hesitated, his feet rooted to the ground. He turned to Marlene, his voice trembling. "What if I'm just making things worse by showing up unannounced?" Marlene placed a hand on his shoulder, meeting his uncertain gaze. "You won't know unless you try," she said gently, "and I'll be with you. We'll figure it out together." Henry nodded slowly, taking a deep breath before stepping onto the train. Marlene followed, her heart heavy with both hope and doubt as the doors slid shut behind them. The train lurched forward, its wheels clacking rhythmically against the tracks as the snowy Iowa countryside blurred past. Inside the warm carriage, the holiday spirit was palpable. Families shared snacks, children giggled over card games, and soft murmurs of conversation filled the air. Marlene settled into her seat next to Henry, who stared out the window, his fingers twitching nervously against his knees. "Whatever happens when we get there," Marlene said gently, breaking the silence, "you won't be alone." Henry turned to her, his weathered face softening. "I don't deserve this," he murmured. "Your kindness, your time." Marlene shook her head. "It's not about what you deserve, Henry. It's about what's right." The two lapsed into a comfortable silence, the rhythmic sound of the train soothing their frayed nerves. After a moment, Henry began to speak, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "Jonathan, he always wanted to be an architect. Even as a kid, he'd build the most incredible structures with whatever he could find, blocks, sticks, even sugar cubes." He chuckled softly, the memory momentarily lifting the weight from his shoulders. "But I was too hard on him. I thought pushing him would make him stronger, but I think I just pushed him away." Marlene listened intently, her mind flashing back to her own struggles. "I grew up without my parents," she said quietly, her fingers tracing the stitching on her coat. "My grandfather raised me. He taught me to always do what's right, even when it's hard. That's why I'm here." Before Henry could respond, a cheerful voice broke through the hum of the train. "I couldn't help but overhear," the woman across the aisle said with a warm smile. She was in her 60s, her silver hair neatly pinned back, and her eyes sparkled with a kindness that immediately put Marlene at ease. "I'm Carol," she continued, leaning forward slightly. "And let me tell you, I know a thing or two about family struggles." Marlene and Henry exchanged glances before Marlene gestured for Carol to continue. "I lost touch with my son for years," Carol said, her voice tinged with both sorrow and hope. "We were both stubborn, too proud to apologize. It wasn't until I nearly lost him for good that I realized how much time we'd wasted." She paused, her gaze distant. "We eventually reconciled, but it taught me that family is worth fighting for. Always." Henry's eyes glistened, and he nodded slowly. "Jonathan loved Christmas," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We used to go to this park with a giant tree. It was his favorite place. I haven't thought about it in years." "Sounds like a good memory to hold on to," Carol said gently, "and maybe a good place to start when you see him again." Marlene felt a pang of doubt creep into her mind. Was she overstepping by involving herself in Henry's personal struggles? She glanced at Carol, who seemed to sense her hesitation. "Sometimes," Carol said softly, "helping someone else find their way can lead you to where you're meant to be." The train began to slow, the screech of its brakes pulling Marlene from her thoughts. Henry leaned toward the window, his hand gripping the edge of the seat. "That's the park," he exclaimed, his voice filled with a mix of excitement and disbelief. "I recognize those lights." Marlene craned her neck to see what Henry was pointing at. Outside, a cluster of twinkling lights illuminated a snow-dusted park, the silhouette of a massive Christmas tree standing proudly in the center. "Are you sure?" she asked, her heart pounding. Henry nodded emphatically, his eyes never leaving the window. "That's it. That's where we used to go." The train hissed to a stop at the bustling Minneapolis station, its whistle cutting through the crisp morning air. Marlene stepped onto the crowded platform, her eyes scanning the sea of travelers bundled in scarves and coats. The festive energy was palpable. Children clutched brightly wrapped presents. Couples sipped steaming cups of coffee, and carolers sang near the entrance. Yet, amidst the cheer, Henry clutched his worn coat tightly, his face a mask of apprehension. "Stay close," Marlene said, guiding him through the throng. "We'll figure this out, Henry." Henry nodded, his gaze darting nervously. "I don't even know if Jonathan wants to see me. What if he's moved? What if he doesn't care anymore?" His voice wavered, carrying years of doubt and regret. "We won't know until we try," Marlene replied firmly, though doubt crept into her own mind. At a kiosk near the exit, Marlene purchased a map and unfolded it on a nearby bench. She approached a station worker, a friendly-looking man with a Santa pin on his jacket, and asked, "Are there any landmarks nearby with a big tree, maybe a park or a square?" The man thought for a moment before pointing at a spot on the map. "Loring Park has a big Christmas tree display this time of year. It's not far, just a short walk that way." "Thank you," Marlene said, folding the map and turning to Henry. "Let's start there." The Christmas market near Loring Park was a kaleidoscope of color and sound. Strings of fairy lights twinkled overhead, casting a warm glow on the vibrant stalls. Vendors called out to passers-by, offering everything from hand-knit scarves to steaming cups of cider. The aroma of roasted chestnuts and hot cocoa filled the air, mingling with the faint sound of a violin playing carols in the distance. "This place is magical," Marlene murmured, but Henry barely heard her. His attention was fixed on a stall selling intricately carved wooden ornaments. His hands trembled as he picked up a small reindeer. "They look just like the ones I used to buy for Jonathan," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every year I'd get him one for the tree. I wonder if he kept them." Marlene placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Let's keep going. Maybe something else here will jog your memory." As they wandered through the market, Henry began recalling fragmented details. "There was a big tree near his place," he said, his brow furrowed in concentration. "And I remember seeing Christmas lights from his window." Marlene's patience started to fray. "Henry, we need more than that. Do you remember a street name, a building, anything concrete?" He shook his head, looking down at his shoes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "It's all just pieces." Marlene sighed, hiding her frustration behind a forced smile. "It's okay. We'll figure it out." In the distance, the towering Christmas tree in Loring Park sparkled like a beacon. Henry's face lit up. "That's it. That has to be it." They hurried toward the park, their breath visible in the cold air. But as they drew closer, Henry's excitement began to fade. The park was beautiful, but nothing else matched his memory. He stood beneath the tree, staring at the decorations with a look of deep disappointment. "I thought this was the place," he said, his shoulders slumping. "I'm leading us in circles." Marlene's heart ached for him, but frustration bubbled to the surface. "Henry, we're doing our best, but we need something solid to go on. We can't just chase memories that might not even exist anymore." Henry winced, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I didn't mean to waste your time." Before Marlene could respond, a voice interrupted them. "Excuse me," said an elderly vendor nearby, adjusting her knitted cap. "Did I hear you say you're looking for Jonathan Wilkinson?" Henry's head snapped up. "Yes, that's my son. Do you know him?" The woman nodded thoughtfully. "Let me check something. I think I've heard that name before. Wait right here." The streets of downtown Minneapolis had grown quieter as the night deepened. The festive lights that hung over the sidewalks twinkled softly, their glow reflecting on the patches of snow that blanketed the ground. Marlene and Henry trudged through the cold, the vendor's tip about Jonathan offering a faint glimmer of hope in their otherwise weary journey. "We need to rest, Henry," Marlene said, glancing at the older man who clutched his coat tightly against the biting wind. His steps were slow, and the lines on his face seemed deeper than ever. "You're exhausted, and we can't think straight if we're this worn out." Henry hesitated, but the weariness in his bones was undeniable. He gave her a small nod. Maybe you're right, just for tonight. They spotted a modest motel with a flickering vacancy sign on the edge of the street. The building was old and slightly run down, its drafty lobby manned by a young receptionist who offered them a warm but reserved smile. "One room," Marlene said, sliding the last of her cash across the counter. She caught Henry's glance and waved off his concern. "Don't argue. This is what we need right now." The motel room was simple, a single bed, a worn armchair, and a tiny kitchenette in the corner. The heater hummed faintly, its warmth a welcome relief from the cold outside. Marlene dropped her bag near the chair and gestured to the bed. "You take it, Henry." "What about you?" he asked, his brows furrowed in concern. "I'm fine with the chair. I'll get some rest," she said with a faint smile. As she moved to arrange a makeshift pillow for herself, Henry noticed the scuffed soles of her sneakers peeking out from under her jeans. "You've been walking on those all day," he said quietly. "They get the job done," Marlene replied, brushing off his concern. She paused for a moment and added, "Sometimes doing the right thing feels like the only choice, and right now helping you feels right." Henry sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands. After a long silence, he said, "Jonathan and we didn't always see eye to eye. I wanted him to follow in my footsteps, but he had other dreams. I pushed too hard and he pushed back harder." Marlene sat down across from him, her expression softening. "What were his dreams?" "Architecture," Henry said, a flicker of pride in his voice. "He always loved building things, even as a kid. He'd use Lego sets to create these incredible structures. Always something original, never following the instructions. I wanted him to go into business, something stable. But he had his heart set on designing buildings." Henry's eyes grew misty as he added, "There was a company he once mentioned working at. I think it had a name like Horizon or Skyline, something about designing sustainable structures." Marlene straightened. "That could be a lead. We'll look into it tomorrow." The next morning, the faint smell of coffee roused Marlene from her uneasy sleep. She opened her eyes to see Henry fumbling with the motel's outdated coffee maker, the machine sputtering and groaning under his attempts. "Need a hand?" she asked, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. He chuckled sheepishly. "If we don't find Jonathan, at least I've got a backup plan as a barista." Marlene laughed, a sound that felt rare but welcome. "Not bad for your first try," she said, taking the steaming cup he handed her. Despite the brief moment of levity, the weight of their situation quickly returned. As they packed their belongings, Marlene felt a pang of worry. Time was running out, and the uncertainty of their search loomed large. At the front desk, the young receptionist handed Marlene a folded piece of paper. "Someone left this for you last night," he said, his tone curious. "I didn't see who." Marlene opened the note, her pulse quickening as she read the hastily scribbled words. "Horizon Architects, downtown, ask for Jonathan." The faint hum of a vacuum cleaner echoed in the motel lobby as Marlene and Henry stood at the reception desk, staring at the note in her hand. The small Christmas tree in the corner flickered sporadically, its inconsistent glow mirroring Henry's shaky breaths. "If you're looking for Jonathan Wilkinson, check Oak Ridge Plaza, 10th floor," Marlene read aloud. The words, hastily scrawled in uneven handwriting, carried both promise and doubt. Henry leaned against the counter, his hands trembling slightly. "Do you think it's real?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marlene folded the note carefully and tucked it into her coat pocket. "There's only one way to find out," she said firmly. "We've come this far. We owe it to ourselves to see this through." The streets of downtown Minneapolis were alive with the sounds of the morning rush. Cars honked impatiently, and the occasional gust of wind sent flurries of snow swirling through the air. The glass facades of the skyscrapers glistened under the pale sunlight, a dazzling display of ambition and opportunity. Marlene walked alongside Henry, holding his arm to steady him as they navigated the icy sidewalks. She noticed his gaze lingering on a toy store window, where a miniature train set wound its way through a snowy landscape of tiny buildings and trees. "I used to build those with Jonathan," Henry said softly, his eyes distant. "He'd spend hours arranging the tracks, always making sure the bridges were perfect." Marlene paused, letting the memory sink in. "Sounds like he inherited your attention to detail," she said with a small smile. Henry chuckled, though the sound was tinged with sadness. "Maybe. I just hope he remembers the good times, not everything else." Oak Ridge Plaza towered over the bustling streets below, its sleek, modern design a stark contrast to the quaint charm of the Christmas market they had passed earlier. Marlene and Henry exchanged nervous glances as they stepped inside, the warmth of the lobby providing little comfort against the weight of their uncertainty. The receptionist at the front desk, a young woman with a polished appearance, hesitated when they asked for Jonathan Wilkinson. "He's in a meeting," she said finally, her tone professional but curious. "You can wait on the 10th floor." They rode the elevator in silence, the soft ding of each passing floor heightening the tension. Henry clutched his coat tightly, his knuckles white. "What if he's angry I came?" he whispered. "What if he tells me to leave?" Marlene placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "You've come this far, Henry. Whatever happens, you'll have me by your side." The 10th floor lobby was quiet, its minimalist decor accentuated by the warm glow of recessed lighting. Marlene guided Henry to a small seating area where he fidgeted with his coat buttons, his eyes darting toward the frosted glass doors ahead. Minutes felt like hours. Marlene tried to distract herself by studying a framed photograph on the wall, an aerial view of the cityscape that reminded her of the view she had seen from the train. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a tall, well-dressed man in his 40s. His sharp features and confident stride exuded authority, but the moment his eyes met Henry's, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. Henry froze, his breath catching in his throat. "That's him," he whispered, his voice trembling with both hope and fear. Marlene reached for his hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "It's time," she said. The elevator doors closed softly behind them, leaving Henry and Marlene standing in the sleek, minimalistic reception area of the 10th floor. The large glass windows offered a stunning view of downtown Minneapolis, the sunlight bouncing off the skyscrapers and bathing the room in a cold glow. Yet, despite the grandeur, Henry's shoulders slumped, his nervous energy filling the space. Through the glass walls of a conference room, Jonathan Wilkinson stood at the head of a polished wooden table, addressing a group of executives. Charts adorned the walls, and his commanding presence was unmistakable. He exuded confidence, his tailored suit and measured gestures projecting success and authority. Henry's hand tightened around the edge of his coat. "He looks so different," he whispered almost to himself. "So sure of himself." Marlene placed a steadying hand on his arm. "He's still your son, Henry. Let's take this one step at a time." When Jonathan finally stepped out of the conference room, his sharp features softened briefly as his eyes landed on Henry, but only for a fleeting second. He quickly masked his reaction, his voice clipped as he asked, "What are you doing here?" Henry opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His eyes darted nervously to Marlene, who stepped forward, her tone gentle but firm. "He's come a long way to see you," she said. Jonathan hesitated, the tension between his professional poise and personal emotions palpable. "Follow me," he said curtly, leading them into his spacious office. The office was a study in modern elegance. A wall of glass showcased the city skyline, while minimalist furniture and carefully chosen decor conveyed both taste and precision. But amidst the sterility were small, personal touches: a framed photo of a younger Jonathan with a golden retriever, and a blueprint of what appeared to be a family home. Jonathan gestured toward two chairs opposite his desk, but he didn't sit. Instead, he stood with his hands in his pockets, his posture rigid. "I don't have much time," he said. His eyes flickered to Henry but didn't linger. Henry's hands twisted nervously in his lap. He started and stopped several times before managing. I needed to see you, to talk." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "After all these years, now you need to talk." His tone was sharp, but there was a tremor beneath it, barely perceptible. Marlene's eyes moved between the two men, sensing the weight of unspoken words. She tried to read Jonathan's expression, but his stoicism held firm. "Henry's here because he knows he made mistakes," she said carefully, her voice low and measured. "He just wants a chance to say what's in his heart." Henry finally spoke, his voice trembling. "I pushed you too hard, Jonathan. I wanted you to follow my dreams, not yours. I didn't listen to what you wanted, what you needed, and for that I'm sorry. Truly." For a moment, Jonathan said nothing. He stared out the window, his reflection in the glass betraying a flicker of emotion. When he finally turned, his voice was tinged with frustration but also sadness. "Do you have any idea how hard it was, always feeling like I wasn't enough? Like nothing I did could ever measure up to what you expected?" Henry's head dropped, his shoulders sagging under the weight of guilt. "I know I failed you. I see that now." The room fell silent, the air thick with unspoken pain. Marlene stood, sensing that this was a moment they needed to navigate alone. "I'll wait outside," she murmured, slipping out quietly. From her seat in the lobby, Marlene could faintly hear the murmur of voices behind the closed door. The pitch rose briefly, the sounds of frustration spilling into the hallway. Then there was silence. Her heart pounded as the door finally opened. Jonathan stepped out, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. He met Marlene's gaze, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said simply. Jonathan's office was cloaked in a silence that felt as heavy as the snowfall outside. The bright morning sun illuminated the city skyline through the expansive windows, but the atmosphere within remained cold and distant. Jonathan sat stiffly behind his desk, his fingers interlaced, his expression unreadable. Across from him, Henry leaned forward slightly, wringing his hands in his lap, the weight of years of estrangement etched deeply into his lined face. "You can't just show up after years and expect everything to be fine," Jonathan said at last, his voice even but laced with a simmering frustration. His piercing gaze bore into his father, daring him to justify his presence. Henry hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find the words. I thought I was doing what was best for you," he began, his voice faltering. "But I see now." He broke off, his hands gripping the edge of the chair as if to steady himself. "I see how wrong I was." Jonathan let out a sharp breath, leaning back in his chair. Do you really?" he shot back. "Every time I tried to do something for myself, something I loved, you made me feel like it wasn't good enough, like I wasn't good enough." The words hung in the air, each one cutting into Henry like shards of glass. He shook his head slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant to make you feel that way." "But you did," Jonathan said firmly, his tone softening for the first time. His hands rested on the desk, his fingers splayed as if anchoring himself. "And when I needed you to understand that, you weren't there." Outside, Marlene wandered the bustling downtown streets, the fresh snowfall crunching softly beneath her boots. Festive lights strung across lampposts glimmered faintly in the morning light, but their warmth felt distant as she wrestled with her own thoughts. She passed a coffee cart and stopped, the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the crisp air. Wrapping her hands around the warm cup, she let out a deep sigh. Memories of her own estranged relationship with her mother surfaced unbidden. Her mother had disapproved of her decision to leave their small hometown, of the life she had chosen for herself. Marlene shook her head, the familiar sting of regret pressing against her resolve. "Maybe I've overstepped," she murmured to herself, watching a snowflake melt against the lid of her coffee cup. But then, as she thought of Henry's trembling hands and Jonathan's guarded expression, her lips pressed into a thin line. Sometimes people need a nudge to face what they've been avoiding. Back in the office, the tension showed no sign of abating. Henry shifted uncomfortably under his son's steady gaze. "I know I can't change the past," he said finally, his voice cracking. "But I came here hoping it wasn't too late to fix what I broke." Jonathan stood abruptly, his chair scraping lightly against the floor. "I don't know if it can be fixed," he said, his voice tinged with both anger and sorrow. He turned away, looking out the window as he added quietly, "I need time to think." Henry remained seated, staring down at his hands, the weight of his son's words pressing on him. His shoulders slumped, and when Marlene re-entered the room, she immediately noticed the tears glistening in his eyes. She crossed to him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. He didn't speak, but the defeated set of his posture said enough. As they exited the building, the chill in the air seemed sharper, more biting. Henry's voice was barely audible as he muttered, "Maybe this was a mistake." Marlene shook her head firmly. "Not yet," she said, her voice steady, though her own doubts whispered at the edges of her mind. Her phone buzzed, cutting through the silence. She glanced at the screen, her brow furrowing at the sight of an unknown number. "Let's see what this is," she murmured, answering the call. The faint sound of a man's voice came through the receiver. "Is this Marlene Cooper? I think I have some information you'll want to hear." The cafe was a welcome escape from the chill outside. Strings of twinkling lights draped across the windows cast a warm glow on the patrons inside. The aroma of cinnamon, freshly brewed coffee, and pastries filled the air, creating an ambiance that momentarily eased the tension between Henry and Marlene. Seated at a corner booth, Henry clasped his hands around a steaming cup of coffee, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his thoughts. Marlene stirred her tea absent-mindedly, her gaze fixed on the festive decorations, as if searching for the right words. "You were a good father at some point, weren't you?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. Henry looked up, startled by the question. He let out a long sigh, his eyes distant. "I tried to be," he said. "There was a time when Jonathan and I had something good, like when I taught him how to ride a bike. He was so determined, kept falling, but he'd brush himself off and try again. He wanted to prove he could do it on his own." Marlene leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "That's something to hold on to. Maybe he just needs to be reminded of that." Henry shook his head. "I don't know if I have enough left to give." Meanwhile, in his sleek office overlooking the bustling streets of Minneapolis, Jonathan leaned back in his chair, staring at the photo of his younger self with his childhood dog. A colleague, Lisa, perched on the edge of his desk, watching him intently. "You've been quiet since the meeting earlier," Lisa said. "What's going on?" Jonathan hesitated before replying, his voice measured. "My father showed up today, out of nowhere." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "And how does that feel?" Jonathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "I've spent years trying to forget how he made me feel, the constant pressure, the way he dismissed what I wanted. But now, I can't stop thinking about what he said, about how he was wrong." Lisa tilted her head. "Maybe this is your chance to tell him how it felt, to make him understand." Jonathan nodded slowly, but the conflict in his eyes lingered. Back at the cafe, the bell above the door jingled, signaling the arrival of a new patron. Marlene looked up and froze as she recognized the older woman walking in. "Carol?" she called out. The widow from the train turned, her face lighting up with recognition. "Well, if it isn't my two favorite traveling companions," she said, making her way to their table. After exchanging pleasantries, Carol sat with them, her calm demeanor bringing a sense of stability. "How's the journey going?" she asked, her gaze shifting between Marlene and Henry. Henry hesitated, but Marlene filled in the gaps. "We found Jonathan, but it's complicated. They've got years of hurt to work through." Carol nodded thoughtfully. "Rebuilding bridges takes time. When I reconnected with my daughter after years of silence, it wasn't easy, but it was worth every uncomfortable moment. Some things take time, but they can still heal." Henry's lips pressed into a thin line. "What if Jonathan doesn't want to build that bridge? What if I've burned it completely?" Carol reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand over his. "Every small step matters. Don't give up now. If you've come this far, there's still hope." As the conversation continued, Marlene's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and frowned at the message. It read, "Meet me at the park tonight. I need to talk." Her heart skipped a beat. She set her phone down and looked at Henry. "I think Jonathan's ready for the next step." Henry's eyes widened. "You think so?" Marlene nodded. "It's not over yet." The park was alive with the soft hum of holiday cheer. Strings of lights twinkled on the massive Christmas tree at its center, casting a warm glow over the snow-covered ground. Families laughed as children ran through the pathways, their boots crunching against the snow. Somewhere nearby, carolers' voices drifted through the crisp air, their melodies a bittersweet counterpoint to the tension in Marlene and Henry's hearts. Marlene glanced at Henry, who stood frozen near the entrance to the park. His breath billowed in small clouds in front of him, and his gloved hands trembled slightly as they gripped the collar of his coat. "You can do this," she said softly, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "He asked you to come. That means something." Henry's voice was barely above a whisper. "What if he regrets it? What if I've hurt him too much for this to mean anything?" Marlene offered a small smile, though her own nerves were beginning to fray. "You don't have to have all the answers tonight. Just show up, that's a start." As they approached the towering Christmas tree, Henry's steps grew slower, his hesitation palpable. Marlene spotted Jonathan standing near one of the benches beneath the tree, his figure partially obscured by shadows. His hands were stuffed deep in his coat pockets, his posture rigid, as though bracing himself for an inevitable storm. When they drew closer, Jonathan turned, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the tree's lights. His expression was guarded, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something, conflict perhaps, or a hesitant longing. Without a word, Jonathan reached into his coat and pulled out a small, neatly wrapped box. The wrapping paper was simple, adorned with a single red ribbon. He extended it toward Henry, his movements deliberate but strained. Henry stared at the box, his confusion evident. "What's this?" he asked, his voice unsteady. Jonathan's jaw tightened, and for a moment he seemed to consider not answering. Finally, he said, "I thought you'd want this back." Henry's hand shook as he took the box, his fingers brushing against the coarse fabric of Jonathan's gloves. Slowly, he removed the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled against soft tissue paper, were relics of a life long past: a worn baseball glove, a hand-carved wooden train set, and a stack of old photographs. The sight of the train set made Henry gasp, his breath catching in his throat. "I made this for you," he murmured, his voice barely audible. His fingers traced the smooth curves of the wood as if reconnecting with the memory embedded in its grain. Jonathan crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on the ground. "You did. I almost threw it away once, but I couldn't." Henry looked up sharply, his eyes glistening. "You kept these?" Jonathan's lips pressed into a thin line. "I couldn't throw them away no matter how angry I was at you. I wanted to, but something always stopped me." The words hung in the cold air between them, fragile yet weighty. Henry clutched the box tighter, his voice trembling as he said, "I didn't know. I never thought." Jonathan met his father's gaze, his expression softening just slightly. "I wanted to hate you, but I couldn't. Not completely." Marlene, sensing the delicate nature of the moment, took a small step back, giving father and son a semblance of privacy. She watched as Henry struggled to find the words, his emotions overflowing in a way she hadn't seen before. "I'm sorry," Henry finally said, his voice breaking. "For all of it. For not seeing you, for not listening. I was so wrong, Jonathan." Jonathan's shoulders relaxed ever so slightly, but the walls he'd built over the years didn't come down entirely. "This doesn't mean everything's fixed," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I need time." Henry nodded quickly, as if afraid of saying the wrong thing. "Take all the time you need. I'll wait." As if the weight of the exchange had become too much, Jonathan took a step back, breaking the moment. He glanced briefly at Marlene, his expression unreadable, before turning away. The sound of his footsteps crunching through the snow faded into the distance. Henry stood motionless, clutching the box like a lifeline. His tears fell freely now, unchecked and unapologetic. Marlene approached him cautiously, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "He didn't walk away forever," she said gently. "That was a start." Henry nodded, though his voice failed him. The snow fell softly around them, the Christmas tree's lights casting a hopeful glow over their figures. Morning sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Jonathan's office, casting long shadows on the polished floor. The sleek design of the space, with its minimalist furniture and carefully curated decor, felt at odds with the emotions stirring within Henry as he stood outside the building, clutching a flyer for the local charity event Marlene had handed him earlier. "You don't have to do this alone," Marlene said, her voice steady but kind. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "If yesterday proved anything, it's that small steps matter." Henry nodded, his grip tightening on the flyer. I don't want to mess this up." The community center buzzed with life, its walls adorned with festive wreaths and strings of colorful lights. Tables lined the room, piled high with donated winter clothing, toys, and food. Volunteers moved with purpose, their laughter and warm chatter filling the air. The scent of spiced cider and freshly baked cookies wafted through the space, adding to the cheerful atmosphere. Henry and Marlene stood near the entrance, where a volunteer coordinator greeted them. "Here to help?" the woman asked with a welcoming smile. Henry hesitated, but Marlene answered for both of them. "Yes, we'd like to volunteer." Before long, Henry found himself serving bowls of hearty soup to families moving through the line. He exchanged shy smiles and murmured well wishes, his initial awkwardness giving way to a quiet sense of purpose. Nearby, Marlene handed out winter coats, her bright energy drawing smiles from children and parents alike. As Henry handed a bowl of soup to a young boy, he noticed the child's threadbare jacket. Without thinking, he gestured for the boy to follow him to the coat table, where Marlene was helping distribute clothing. "This one should keep you warm," Henry said, holding up a thick navy coat. The boy's eyes lit up as he tried it on, turning to show his mother, who nodded gratefully. Marlene watched the interaction with a soft smile. "You're a natural at this," she said. Henry shook his head, his voice tinged with emotion. "I don't know about that, but it feels right." Across the room, Jonathan stood near the entrance, his arms crossed as he scanned the bustling scene. His professional demeanor faltered when his gaze landed on Henry, who was now kneeling to help the young boy zip up his new coat. For a moment, Jonathan's expression softened, the hardened lines of his face giving way to something more vulnerable. Marlene caught sight of Jonathan and nudged Henry gently. "Look who's here." Henry turned, his breath catching as he saw his son standing across the room. For a moment, neither moved, the crowd around them blurring into the background. Jonathan approached slowly, his hands in his coat pockets. His voice was quieter than usual as he said, "I didn't expect to see you here." Henry straightened, his hands clasped nervously in front of him. "I wanted to do something that mattered," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Even if it's just a small step." Jonathan studied him for a long moment before nodding slightly. "It's a good step." The event continued around them, but the air between father and son felt charged with unspoken words. Marlene watched from a respectful distance, her heart swelling with cautious optimism. She turned as a familiar voice greeted her. "Well, isn't this a surprise?" said Carol, the widow they had met on the train. She carried a tray of cookies, her warm smile as radiant as the Christmas lights strung above them. "Carol," Marlene exclaimed, embracing her briefly. "What brings you here?" "Oh, I volunteer every year," Carol replied. Her gaze shifted to Henry and Jonathan. "It looks like your journey is making progress." Marlene nodded. "It's slow, but it's happening." Carol's eyes twinkled with wisdom. "Sometimes, slow is the best way. It gives people time to heal." As the event wound down, Jonathan approached Henry and Marlene near the coat table. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was softer than before. "There's something I need to say," he began. "Can we grab a coffee? My treat." Henry's eyes widened, and Marlene gave him an encouraging nod. "We'd love to," she said. Jonathan gestured toward the door, and the three of them began to make their way out into the snowy evening. Marlene glanced at Henry, whose tentative smile hinted at a newfound sense of hope. The cafe was a serene retreat from the bustling streets outside, its warm lights reflecting off the frosted windows. A faint melody of holiday music played in the background, blending with the low hum of conversation. Marlene, Henry, and Jonathan sat at a corner table, their cups of coffee untouched. Jonathan broke the silence first. His hands rested flat on the table as he stared at the swirling steam rising from his mug. "I've been thinking about last night," he began, his voice steady but low. "And everything you said." Henry's grip tightened on his coffee cup. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he fought to keep his emotions in check. Jonathan raised a hand, silencing him. "Let me finish." He exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "I've built a life without you. For a long time, I thought that was enough. But seeing you now..." His gaze flickered to Henry before darting away. "It's complicated." Henry's brow furrowed, and he leaned forward, his voice trembling. "I never meant to push you away. I thought I was helping you, guiding you. But I see now how much I hurt you. I can't change the past, but I want to make things right. If you'll let me." The vulnerability in Henry's voice hung in the air, unspoken emotions weaving between father and son. Marlene sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, observing the raw exchange with a mixture of hope and caution. Jonathan's lips twitched, caught between a grimace and a smirk. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his tone sharper now. "It wasn't just about the pressure you put on me. It was the way you made me feel, like nothing I did was ever good enough." Henry flinched as if struck. "I thought I was protecting you," he said softly. "But I see now I was only trying to mold you into someone you didn't want to be, and for that, I'm sorry." Jonathan sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Do you know how many years I spent blaming you? It was easier to hate you than admit that I missed you." His voice cracked slightly, and he quickly looked away, blinking back moisture in his eyes. The confession stunned Henry into silence. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. It was Marlene who finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "You've both carried this burden alone for too long. Maybe it's time to share it." Both men turned to her, their expressions mirroring each other in surprise. Jonathan rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly, his gaze darting to the window. "If we're going to try this," he said slowly, "it won't be easy." Henry straightened, his resolve hardening. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes." Jonathan studied him for a long moment before nodding, a flicker of something akin to acceptance crossing his face. "Are you sure?" he asked, his tone more vulnerable than before. "Because this isn't going to be a quick fix." Henry met his son's gaze with quiet determination. "I'm sure. For the first time in years, I'm absolutely sure." The tension between them eased, but the air remained charged with unspoken promises. Marlene allowed herself a small smile, sensing that this was the first step toward healing, a fragile olive branch extended across years of hurt. The server approached, setting down a plate of holiday cookies. Jonathan glanced at them and chuckled dryly. Mom always made gingerbread cookies this time of year. Hers weren't nearly this neat, though. Henry's eyes softened at the mention of his late wife. She always said the messier, the better. For the first time, a genuine smile tugged at Jonathan's lips. It was small, fleeting, but it was there. He picked up a cookie and held it up to his father. "To messy beginnings, then." Henry chuckled, his laughter tinged with tears. "To messy beginnings." As the three of them shared a quiet laugh, the moment felt like a small but significant victory. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, it felt navigable. Snowflakes fell softly over Minneapolis, blanketing the bustling streets in a pristine layer of white. Holiday shoppers hurried past, their arms laden with colorful bags as laughter and chatter filled the crisp air. Henry and Jonathan walked side by side, their breath visible in the cold as silence hung between them. Jonathan glanced sideways at his father, his hands buried in his coat pockets. "So," he began, breaking the ice, "what have you been doing all these years?" Henry hesitated, the question catching him off guard. "Oh, not much," he admitted. "Mostly just getting by." He paused, then added, "I've followed your career, though. I always knew you'd make something of yourself." Jonathan's brow furrowed, but he said nothing. They continued walking, weaving through the crowd until they reached a quieter street. The atmosphere felt less tense now, the conversation shifting to lighter topics. Jonathan talked about his company and the challenges he faced building it from the ground up. As he spoke, Henry listened intently, his eyes filled with pride. "You've done well," Henry said softly. "Better than I could have ever imagined." Jonathan's lips curved into a small, almost reluctant smile. "Thanks," he murmured, his voice tinged with surprise. Ahead, the glittering lights of an outdoor ice rink caught their attention. Families and children glided across the ice, their laughter echoing through the crisp winter air. Jonathan slowed his pace, his gaze fixed on the rink. "Do you remember this?" Henry asked, his voice carrying a note of nostalgia. "I used to take you skating when you were little. You were so determined to stay on your feet, even at 6. Jonathan chuckled, a genuine laugh that softened his features. "Yeah, I think I've always had something to prove, haven't I?" Henry smiled wistfully. "You always did, and you always succeeded." They stood in silence for a moment, the memories filling the space between them. Then, unexpectedly, Jonathan turned to his father. "Want to give it a try?" he asked, nodding toward the rink. Henry blinked, startled. "Skating? At my age?" He chuckled nervously. "I'd probably break something." Jonathan smirked. "You won't. I'll make sure of it." Before Henry could protest further, Jonathan was already heading toward the rental booth. Moments later, they were lacing up their skates, Henry muttering under his breath about how this was a terrible idea. But as they stepped onto the ice, the tension melted away. Jonathan skated backward, holding Henry's hands to steady him. Their movements were wobbly at first, but soon they found a rhythm, laughter spilling from their lips as they circled the rink. "You're better at this than I expected," Jonathan teased. "And you're a better teacher than I remembered," Henry shot back, grinning. For the first time in years, the weight of their estrangement felt lighter. After a few laps, they retreated to a bench at the edge of the rink, their breath coming in puffs of white. Henry leaned back, a contented smile on his face. "This feels good," he said. "Like old times." Jonathan nodded, his expression contemplative. "It does," he admitted. Then his gaze grew serious. "But there's something else I need to tell you, something I've never said before." Henry's smile faltered, replaced by a look of concern. "What is it, son?" Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He stared at the ice, his hands clasped tightly together. "It's about why I stayed away for so long," he began, his voice low, "and why I'm still afraid to let you back in." The weight of his words hung heavily in the air, leaving Henry and Marlene, who watched from a distance, on edge. Jonathan's apartment was just as Henry had imagined it, sleek and modern, with sharp lines and muted colors. Yet there were touches of warmth scattered throughout, family photos on a shelf, a soft throw draped over the couch, and a Christmas tree adorned with white lights in the corner. The faint smell of pine lingered in the air, mingling with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Jonathan motioned for Henry to sit down, his movements slow and deliberate, as if weighing every step. Marlene lingered near the entrance, sensing this was a conversation meant for father and son. Jonathan glanced at her and gave a small nod. "You can stay," he said softly, "if you want." Marlene smiled reassuringly but stayed quiet, taking a seat near the window. Jonathan settled into the armchair across from Henry, his posture tense. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence filled with the soft hum of the heating system. "I need to tell you something," Jonathan began, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "It's something I've kept to myself for years." Henry leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "You can tell me anything, son. I'm here." Jonathan took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I've spent my whole life trying to prove myself. To you, to others, to myself. But no matter what I achieved, it never felt like enough." His voice faltered and he looked up, meeting his father's eyes. "Because deep down I always felt like I wasn't enough." Henry's face crumpled, a mix of guilt and sorrow washing over him. "Oh, Jonathan, I never meant for you to feel that way. I thought I was helping." Jonathan shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I know, and maybe you were in your own way, but it came at a cost. For years I hid behind my success, pretending I was fine, but I wasn't." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I've struggled with anxiety, crippling, relentless anxiety, that made me doubt every decision I ever made." The room fell silent, the weight of Jonathan's confession hanging heavy in the air. Henry's hands trembled as he reached for his son's. I had no idea," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I failed you in ways I didn't even realize. I'm so sorry, Jonathan." Jonathan squeezed his father's hand, his own eyes glistening. "I don't want to blame you anymore, Dad. I've carried this pain for too long, and I don't want to carry it alone anymore." Marlene, sitting quietly, finally spoke. Her voice was gentle but firm. "It's never too late to start over. The fact that you're both here talking about this, that's the first step." Jonathan nodded, his expression softening. "I want to rebuild this relationship, but it's going to take time." Henry nodded fervently. "I'll do whatever it takes, son, whatever you need." They sat in silence for a moment, the unspoken understanding between them more powerful than any words. Then Jonathan stood and walked over to a drawer, pulling out a small envelope. He returned to Henry and handed it to him. "This might help you understand me better," Jonathan said, his voice quiet but steady. "It's something I wrote a long time ago." Henry took the envelope with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the front. He looked up at his son, his expression filled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "What's inside?" Henry asked. Jonathan stepped back, his arms crossed. "Read it when you're ready," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Henry stared at the envelope, the anticipation heavy in his chest. Whatever was inside, he knew it would change everything. The scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air as laughter echoed through Henry's cozy home. The Christmas tree in the corner sparkled with white and gold lights, its branches adorned with ornaments that had been carefully unpacked from storage. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the gathering of family and friends. Jonathan stepped through the doorway, a smile lighting up his face as he balanced a stack of wrapped gifts. "Merry Christmas, everyone," he called, his voice filled with a lightness that had been absent for years. Henry looked up from the kitchen, his heart swelling with pride as he watched his son greet the younger relatives with easy charm. Jonathan knelt to show Henry's youngest grandchild how to unwrap a toy truck, his laughter blending into the cheerful hum of the room. It was a sight Henry thought he'd never see again, and he took a moment to let it sink in. Marlene sat on the couch, sipping hot cocoa and quietly observing. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction watching Henry and Jonathan together, their bond slowly mending. It reminded her of her own journey, the strength it had taken to rebuild relationships in her life. She caught Henry's eye and gave him a small, knowing smile. As the evening unfolded, Henry found a quiet moment to himself in the study. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope Jonathan had given him the night before. Inside was a letter, its edges slightly yellowed, written in Jonathan's familiar handwriting. Henry began to read. "Dad, I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to send this, but I need to put it into words. For so long, I've felt like I wasn't good enough. No matter how hard I tried, it seemed like I couldn't meet your expectations. I pushed myself to succeed, not for me, but for you. I wanted you to be proud of me, to tell me that I was enough, but in the process, I lost myself, and I lost you. Despite everything, I still love you. I always have. I just didn't know how to say it. I hope someday we can find our way back to each other. I hope someday you'll see me, not for what I've done, but for who I am. With love, Jonathan." Tears blurred Henry's vision as he read the final line. He folded the letter carefully and held it to his chest, his heart aching with both regret and gratitude. In that moment, he resolved to be the father Jonathan had always deserved. Later, as dinner was served, Henry stood to give a toast. The room quieted as he raised his glass, his voice trembling slightly. "This year has been one of learning and healing," he began. "I've realized it's never too late to say I'm sorry, to make things right, and to cherish what truly matters." He turned to Jonathan, his eyes shining. "To my son, who has taught me the meaning of love and forgiveness, to new beginnings." The room erupted in applause, and Jonathan gave his father a smile filled with warmth and pride. As the family exchanged gifts, Jonathan handed Henry a carefully wrapped box. Inside was a framed photograph of the two of them skating at the rink, taken just days earlier. Below the photo, a caption read, "New memories, new beginnings." Henry looked up, his eyes meeting Jonathan's. "Thank you, son," he said softly. As the evening wound down, the family gathered around the Christmas tree. Jonathan leaned over to Henry, his voice low but filled with determination. "Dad," he said, "there's something I'd like you to help me with next year." Henry raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "What is it?" he asked. Jonathan smiled, his expression hopeful. "Let's talk about it tomorrow," he said. "For now, let's just enjoy tonight." Henry nodded, a sense of peace settling over him as the room filled with laughter and cheer. He knew this was just the beginning of their journey, and for the first time in years, he felt ready to face whatever came next. As the story concludes, we are reminded of the transformative power of forgiveness and the importance of taking steps, however small, toward healing fractured relationships. Henry and Jonathan's journey shows us that it's never too late to mend what's been broken, to say the words we've left unspoken, and to create new memories even after years of estrangement. Their story is a testament to resilience, love, and the enduring bonds of family. It also begs the question, how many of us are holding on to unresolved pain, waiting for the right moment to make amends? Perhaps the best time to start is now. Is there someone in your life you've been meaning to reconnect with? What's holding you back? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to our channel to join us for more heartfelt tales that explore the challenges and triumphs of the human spirit. Your support helps us continue bringing stories like this to life, and we look forward to sharing the next one with you. Don't forget to like, comment, and share with those who might need a little encouragement today. Together, let's keep the conversation going.